another episode of Trinidad Bhojpuri Words and a Phrase. In this episode, we take a look at the words KAAKAA, KHONSLAY, CHHOORI or chaku, the Trinidad Bhojpuri phrase ACHARAA, KHONSLAY, LAKAREE-KATWA, and SAKAR. Let's go catch up with Vinay of the Cutlass magazine.
So this is the sari. Right, they're doing it like this, right? The mashing up so. I'm Karen Das.
And I'm Vinay Harrichan from the Cutlass magazine.
Great to see you again, Vinay. Now, we started the week with family relations. And so we went with KAAKAA, KAAKEE. And many of you were very anxious and excited to respond to this because for a very long time, for some of you, you were able to identify words like KAAKAA and KAAKEE because you actually know them. You know these people in your family.
Yes, exactly. So your KAAKAA and your KAAKEE. Your KAAKAA is your father's younger brother, and your KAAKEE is your father's younger brother's wife. So your KAAKEE is not a blood-related aunt. She's a aunt by marriage, and your KAAKAA is a blood-related uncle on your father's side. Now, some people were saying generally it's your father's brother and your father's brother's sister. However, traditionally, we know that KAAKAA and KAAKEE has to do with your father's younger brother and younger sister-in-law. Dada and Daddy, that would be older brother and older sister-in-law. So it's important to have that differentiation there. And it's also important to note that some Muslim people might not say KAAKAA and KAAKEE. They might use the more standard Urdu, Chacha and Chachi.
And someone did make mention of that. I think that person was from Guyana.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's just important to note here that you have specific titles for people in the family. Now, because of modern lifestyle and the Western culture, people just simply say auntie, uncle, mommy, daddy, grandma, grandpa, cousin, mother-in-law, father-in-law. But in this particular culture, in Indian culture, it's just so unique that specific titles were given to people in the family. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason for that.
Yeah, and it's so important for us to hold on to it because, as we know with Indian people, they tend to live in joint family units, which is, when someone gets married, they go to live with their in-laws, they have multiple families under one roof. And so these words are meant to give respect, that you don't just call someone by name, you give them their own unique title, and that title commands a level of respect. So it's really good for us to continue using these words. I use these words and, we pass it on to the younger generation. And if you're looking for a brief explanation in song, I would reference Videsh Sukhu's song or Vikash Sukhu's song, KAAKAA and KAAKEE, where he gives a brief little kahani or story in the beginning of it.
Well, on the Indian side, there's called your father small brother your KAAKAA, and there's called his wife your KAAKEE.
That's right. So yes, we do keep these words. Well, there are some of the words that are still in use, like mausi, and and some people still use the word mamu, except it's more of a casual reference. Anybody older, you simply call them mamu, which is incorrect, but the word is still out there. But it's nice to hold on to these specific titles. It's a great way for us to retain identity. Yes. Let's move on to another Trinidad Bhojpuri word, CHHOORI or chaku. And I put the both words because some might be familiar with one more than the other one. CHHOORI or chaku.
Yeah, so churi or chaku are the Hindustani words for a small knife.
My weakness, it's small knives.
Just let me go.
Anything but knives! Oh, it's so simple.
It's not a cutlass, that's a different kind of knife. This is more of a small knife that, you'd use for cutting carrots or onion or garlic or stuff like that. So it's a small knife. So you could always tell your kids, hey, churi leana or churi leke aao, stuff like that. Bring the small knife to me.
Right, and this takes us into our Trinidad Bhojpuri phrase, and this was my favorite for the entire week. ACHARAA, KHONSLAY. ACHARAA, KHONSLAY.
Mm-hmm. So ACHARAA means to take the end of your orhani, and people know the old ladies, they would wear their orhani and they would have the end of it, and they would take it and they would stick it in at their waist, and it forms a fold. So ACHARAA is the end of that orhani, and khonsle means to tuck it in, to fold it in. So it's important to pair the noun there with the verb.
Right. So we learned two words, the achara, because there was on a radio show, some people mentioned that they had no idea that there was a word for that end of the orhani.
Yeah, because some people might know, because people know about the sari, they know about a dupatta, they know about a lenga, and so they might know the standard Hindi word palu, meaning the end of your dupatta that you might drape over your shoulder, you might tuck in, or you might use as a dupatta. But yeah, the end of the sari, the way people refer to that as a palu, in our Trinidad Bhojpuri context, it's important to know that that is an achara, or some people might know the a more standard Hindi version, Achal. So Achara or Achal.
And if you like your oldie goldies, there's a song, Chhod do aanchal zamana kya kahe. Oh, that's just my version. All right, so we can move on to another Trinidad Bhojpuri word, LAKAREE-KATWA. Well, two words. Again, we're learning extra words here. LAKAREE-KATWA. And Vinay, you told me about LAKARHARA.
Yeah, so LAKAREE-KATWA or LAKARHARA are the Trinidad Bhojpuri words for wood cutter. So people might know that Lakari, or Lakar, those are the Hindustani words for wood. And so Katwa comes from Kate or Katawe, meaning to cut. So Lakrihara, Lakarhara, or Lakree-Katwa are all variations of saying, the wood cutter. And there's actually a popular wedding song. There's a folk wedding song, and there's a chutney song. And the chutney song goes, Lakarhara bulai ke katao lakari, katao lakari. Which means, someone call the woodcutter and have him come and cut some wood, and you'll hear it used in that context.
So on Friday, we usually go with a food-related word and a sweet word at that this last Friday. We went with the word SAKAR. Now, I know we're all familiar with chini for sugar, and chini chali, also part of the Trinidad Bhojpuri feature. So we know that you're good with your chini and chini chali. But I thought it would be interesting to put the SAKAR in the mix to see if anybody out there would be able to identify this word as a Bhojpuri word, also a Trinidad Bhojpuri word. That wasn't the case, as most people went with chini being sugar, and they knew that, and they just went with the hint. And I want to note messages from Kishore, Viraj, and a couple of others as well, who brought up the fact that, and based on their experience, that SAKAR came up as a Hindi word with their experience. Now, my first encounter with the word SAKAR came through an interview that featured historian Professor Brinsley Samaru. Now, he used a SAKAR, and he also used SAKAR Ganna. Dr. Disham Bhimal of Caribbean Hindustani confirmed its use, SAKAR, in an interview with an elderly Bhojpuri speaker. He also confirmed that it is present in the Bhojpuri dictionary as a cognate of that word shakkar as SAKAR. So what has been your experience with the word, Vinay?
Yeah, so just to kind of go off of that point, how you mentioned that in the Bhojpuri dictionary, it's listed as SAKAR, and it's derived from the Hindi shakar. As we know, oftentimes when you go from Hindi to Bhojpuri, you might lose a certain degree of aspiration, so then shakar becomes sakar. And as you mentioned, there are two main references that kind of got us thinking. There's the Brinsley Samaru reference of the sakar gana being sugar, and there's also a reference of a dessert known as sakar para in India that we know as kurma. And they call it sakar para because they're using sugar to make that dessert. And so those are kind of two major references that got us thinking there. And in our research or in our searches, we found that there seemed to be a consensus online and from people in the Indian community that SAKAR had more to do with sweetener, it had more to do with brown sugar, brown rock sugar, whereas chini seems to be more associated with white granulated sugar. Now, one thing that we were both sort of confused about or interested in was the fact that sugarcane would be referred to as Sakar Gunna, because Gunna is by itself used to mean sugarcane. So adding the sucker to it, it's almost like they're saying sugarcane.
Mm-hmm.
In a Hindi dictionary, I did see that the word sucker is also defined as something having a sweet root. So it could be in a reference to something like a sweet potato having a sweet root or sugarcane having a sweet root. So that kind of just adds to the layer of definition there with the difference between them. But yeah, it seems like sucker has more to do with brown sugar, sweetener, whereas chini would be white granulated sugar.
Uh-huh. Yes. And we also want to make mention of jaggery because someone did post that up asking, well, what about jaggery? And thinking, okay, so one at a time. But yes, that also came up as a sweetener.
Yeah, and because in India they use jaggery to mean a dark brown sugar and a dark
Mhm.
brown sweetener. Now, one thing that we're also curious to know is that people watching, if they are familiar with like a Hindustani word that they had used for molasses, because I can't imagine that a word like molasses being so popular in the Caribbean would not have some sort of Hindustani equivalent. And as we know, with words like cocoa, for example, even though that's a English word or not a Hindi word, those words would have been Bhojpurized or Hindivized or something like that and turned into something like kakuya, which we know is what some older Indian people used to refer to as cocoa. So I'm curious to know if perhaps jaggery might be used in the Caribbean to mean molasses because there is that connotation of it having to be a dark brown sugar or a dark brown sweetener. You would not use jaggery to refer to as, white granulated sugar. There's a certain difference there.
And just quickly mention the use of the word chini and chini dad.
Yeah, so for example, Karen just referenced chini chale, which we know means to sift sugar. You might know of that sieve that they refer to as a chalni. So chini chale has to do with sifting sugar. And so a lot of these Indian people that were recruited from India to Trinidad, being told that they were about to, reap gold and stuff like that, they started referring to Trinidad as Chinidad because they thought that it was the land of sugar, the land of gold, Chini, as we mentioned, being sugar. And it's very similar, for example, to Suriname, another place that Indian indentured laborers were taken to. They would refer to Suriname as Sri Ram. So they kind of had a certain Indianized interpretation of these names for places that they were going to.
Wow. Okay, so it's a lot to take in with just that one word, sucker, and even with the chini. But you realize that how very intricate and how very unique this all is, falling under the Hindustani language. So we want to thank you all very much for posting your comments and even for questioning some of the words, because when you do so in a constructive manner, then it gives us the opportunity now to go further into research and to interact with others and see just where we might have gone wrong or if we're actually on the right track. So thank you all very much. And again, yes, if you have come across a Hindustani word for molasses, please share with us. And on that note, here's how you can get in touch with Vinay.
Yes, you can follow me at Cutlass Podcast. Actually, it's at Cutlass Magazine now. So at Cutlass Magazine on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, or you can send me a message, cutlasspodcast@gmail.com, and I'll just tag on to the end of that and say, let us know if you've heard Sakar Gana for sugarcane or if you've heard the word Ketari, because we know Ketari and there's also Sakar Gana. So if you have heard a difference there being used by elders, if you can remember that, please go ahead and share that with us.
Yes, wonderful. So thank you all once again, and keep up with more Trinidad Bhojpuri words and phrase. Till next time. Bye.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this Trinidad Bhojpuri words and phrase episode. This has been a KDC production in collaboration with the Cutlass magazine, Caribbean Hindustan.